All right, I have 1 o'clock. So I'd say let's go ahead and jump right into it, and we'll leave the room open as folks join. They can join us. But first, thank you all so much for attending the last Brownfield Redevelopment webinar of the year. We will reconvene in 2024 and use next month, which is right around the corner of December here, to start planning some really fun new opportunities that we'll share a little bit later in today's webinar. For folks who have joined us previous webinars, thank you for joining this last one of the year. If this is your first webinar that you've joined us, welcome. This is a new opportunity as a part of a partnership between the University of Kentucky's Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky and the Cabinet for Energy and Environment. As a part of this new partnership, we are deploying some new education and outreach and technical assistance opportunities, and one in particular that we are excited to launch in the new year that we'll be sharing as we get to the end of today's webinar. But today, really what we're talking about is what do we do after the grant cycle, right? So what's next? For folks who may have been working on a brownfield project this year, you probably submitted a application just recently that you've been working on, and if so, congratulations. Whether or not that gets funding, you put in a lot of work, and really the topic of today's conversation is how can you leverage all of that work that you did to pull that application together, whether or not you hear back that you receive funding in the spring. We hope that you do, and we hope that we can support you as you work to implement that project. But really, what we want to talk about today is how can you get the biggest bang for the buck, considering all of the energy and investments that you've made over the last few months as you pulled that application together, and how can you really leverage all of that value that you've invested into your application, or into sort of thinking about an application as you sort of approach the coming months to get best prepared to approach that redevelopment project. So as you can see, sort of on the right side of the slide there, really what we're going to cover today is what to expect if your funding request is approved this spring, some strategies for you to leverage the value of that recently submitted application, and then how to prepare for next year's application in the fall if you're just getting started. So,
right.
You want to hit our next slide there?
Yeah, I was trying. There was a little bit of a lag there.
No, it's all right. So, if you have joined us in previous webinars, you may know myself. I'm Shane Barton, the Downtown Revitalization Coordinator with the University of Kentucky's Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky. It's such a long title and a tongue twister to say. And with me today is Kiersten O'Leary, the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the State Brownfield Office. And we're going to be sharing responsibilities, sort of going through the webinar today. One bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom. You should see it in your menu. If you move your slide around, it should pop that menu up. You'll see a Q&A box. Feel free to share any questions or comments that you may have, and we'll circle back to those at the end of the webinar and make sure those get addressed before we wrap up today. Okay?
Yeah. Well, I see many familiar faces joining us today, a lot of applicants from this year and previous years. So again, we appreciate you all joining us today. And, at this point, a lot of you know what a big deal this is and what a historic time this is for brownfields and just the funding levels in general. There's a huge push and focus on community-led revitalization efforts and serving those underserved communities that maybe have not ever had brownfield funding or access to brownfield funding before. There's a lot more grants at significantly higher amounts, and that was over the course of 5 years, fiscal year 22 to 26. And if you're anything like me, that sounds like you still got a lot of time left, but when all the pieces fit together, you realize that there's only 2 cycles left to apply. Those that applied in November were applying for fiscal year 24. So we just have fiscal year 25 and 26 left contingent upon any, changes at the federal level that may impact that funding. This funding is eligible for assessing and cleaning up brownfields primarily. And I do want to point out that offerings for funding do sometimes change. Like this past year, they did not offer a revolving loan fund. And there's a potential that next year that could come back into play, or that, something else might drop off. I mean, assessment and cleanup are always going to be there in different capacities, but those different offerings like the RLF and multi-purpose grants, especially, if you're targeting one of those are kind of time sensitive in terms of what will be offered from year to year. So I just want to bring a little bit of attention to that. So this was kind of anticipated, what we anticipated going into the fiscal year 24 grant cycle, but the same could be applied to what we're anticipating for fiscal year 25. The solicitations go out in the fall. You have about 60 days, and then awards are announced in the spring, late spring. If you just recently applied, I wouldn't anticipate to hear anything until about mid to end of May is what has been consistent the last couple of years. Your project periods can vary from 3 to 5 years, and those funds are made available kind of summer, fall-ish. But I just want to give you kind of an overview of the technical, what's actually going to happen from here, whether or not you applied this cycle and are going to get funded or not get funded, or if you're just now starting to think about preparing an application for next fall. So kind of the rational order of things in terms of if you get awarded. There's a lot of things that happen in terms of like threshold review and narrative review kind of in the meantime, but we're kind of skipping ahead to the announcement. So again, sometime in May, probably you will know whether or not your project was selected for funding or not. And typically before the big announcement is made, they will let you know via email a couple weeks before. I did notice that in the RFP that it says that if you do not meet that threshold criteria, kind of that pass or fail section of the grant, then they will let you know within 15 calendar days of when that ineligibility determination was made. Now, I don't know when they make those determinations, but at least you won't be waiting, that whole time to figure out whether or not you at least passed the threshold. But so after those announcements are made, you will connect with an EPA project officer. That person is going to be with you throughout the course of your grant project period. You will be looking at procurement, number one, for how you're going to go after an environmental consultant to carry out the work that you applied for in your application. Just paying special attention. We'll touch on this a little bit later, but just paying special attention to making sure that everything is compliant, you're doing things the way that you're supposed to be doing. That's going to be important throughout this whole process. So you'll have a new grantee meeting that is a requirement of the grant in the fall. They usually do like 2 regional locations that you're able to go to within EPA Region 4. And then after that, or sometime around then, you will get your cooperative agreement and get access to that funding. And then you can begin spending that. And again, at that point, you're working with your project officer and your environmental consultant to kind of go through that process and iron all of that out. I will say that costs for like the new grantee meeting and anything that would be considered pre-award costs, you will want to make sure, or you will have already had to have outlined that within your application if you requested any pre-award costs. So maybe take a look back at your application, see if you did those once you get the announcement. But if you do not get approved in the spring, if you don't get the award, you do have an opportunity to debrief with EPA just to see how your application scored, things you might be able to take back to the drawing board and do better for next time. I just want to remind everyone that this is highly competitive funding, and it was competitive even prior to the bill funding. And so it might take more than one try for you to get your application scored well enough to get that funding. But you've put a lot of time and resources into the application, and none of that goes to waste. None of that has to go to waste. There are a lot of things that you can be doing in the meantime, things that we're going to touch on throughout this presentation to continue with your goals of brownfield redevelopment. And, we had somebody fiscal year 23 that did not get funded, but then went ahead and took advantage of several opportunities that we have at the state level with our targeted brownfield assessments on some priority properties, and started making some headway. If you have a particular site that you're looking to, get movement on, you can get a, depending on availability, if there's funding available in our Cleaner Commonwealth Fund, our revolving loan fund, you can use some of that to kind of kick off a project. And, you would still be eligible for more cleanup funding through EPA if you took advantage of that. But yeah, there's a lot of time, after that, or actually not a lot of time after that announcement is made, say in May, for that next funding cycle to be made available in, potentially September. So, but you've got all the bones of your application and everything that you need to build on that for the next funding cycle.
And I think, I would add that one of the biggest things to think about as we sort of go through the next quarter, really waiting for those announcements, is that it's really about maintaining momentum. That you've invested lots of energy and time in developing your project and your proposal. You began to engage your community and think about your vision and reuse strategies. But really, what we're talking about is maintaining momentum moving forward, and adding value to all of the work that you've invested in. And sort of building off of that, as we think about, some of the strategies that you can use to leverage the value of your recently submitted application, whether or not it was funded or not. In particular, if you applied for a green up or a cleanup application, it's really important to keep your community involved and engaged in the process. That public perception and involvement can really pay dividends as you begin to move forward and manage the project, and keep folks involved and aware of kind of what you all are doing on the ground, or what your coalition is working on. So some of the things that you may also want to consider is continue thinking about the site reuse strategies. Just because you've planned a proposal doesn't mean that your community redevelopment planning should stop. Continue thinking about and imagining what the most appropriate reuse is for that site or for those buildings. Think about your planning. How does your idea continue to connect with emerging plans or visions from the community? And perhaps most important, and we'll touch on this a little bit more specifically, is these tend to be pretty expensive projects, in particular cleanups. And while EPA grants can fund specific cleanup actions, they can't often fund all of the components of your full redevelopment vision. So it really is critical to continue thinking about other forms of capital and resource road mapping as you move forward, thinking about what's next, whether or not your cleanup grant is funded or not. So, these are just a couple of the things to keep in your mind, as we sort of enter that waiting period, for lack of better terms, between now and spring announcements.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I do just want to draw special attention to, I think this keeping the community informed and this public perception piece is especially important in regard to cleanup grants, because when you are dealing with a piece of property or, blighted, abandoned building that people have been living with as an eyesore for a long time, they see something exciting. They're like, oh, you got, $500,000 grant to clean this up. They're like, well, what's happening with it? They got the money to do that. Why hasn't it started yet? And, some of that is going to boil down to like education about the actual grant and what it's allowed to do. This is not a redevelopment of the entire property, just the cleanup of the environmental contamination that's on site. but people want to see that there's things happening. And we all know how it goes with government. There's a lot of hurry up and wait. But I think just communicating that to folks is crucial.
Yeah. And then, if you applied for an assessment grant, continue thinking about those end uses, right? And we've touched on this through many of our webinars and other outreach efforts, is that your redevelopment idea is an iterative process, that it will likely change as you learn more, as you do assessments, as you sort of implement things that are allowable through the assessment grant that we'll touch on. But really, continue thinking about those end uses and how that end use really matches or blends well with the community needs and the vision and existing plans or emerging plans. But one thing that we do want to share here is that there are a number of eligible activities, planning activities in particular, that are appropriate under assessment grants. So, like we've said here, just to sort of double down on this again, is that, really it's about sort of continuing communication, thinking about and helping the broader community understand your site reuse goals and how those may align with local economic conditions or economic visions, existing infrastructure, or other existing conditions, those community needs. And if you filled out your application, you remember there's a big section around community need and sort of having to articulate how the proposed activities and reuse connect with those community needs. But again, there are a number of planning activities that are approved activities for an assessment grant. So here is a long list of resources available. And we'll touch on some of these and give you a little sense. The website there in blue, just above the footer, if you go to that website, you will be able to download a number of 1- and 2-page guides that sort of talk through what each of these mean and really sort of what you could gain from them or from implementing these. Again, these are sort of approved processes with assessment grants. When you go to that website, this is the example. There are a number of 1- and 2-pagers. These are each sort of crammed with wonderful information. And one thing that I would also recommend, even if you decide not to use your own grant monies to engage in these activities, do explore these, because these may provide you some insight on things that you may be able to do or may be able to approach as part of some community engagement or reuse planning on your own, or in partnership with our new Brownfield Community Assistance Program that we'll be launching in the new year to sort of work and support communities navigating this. But just to give you some more details about what each of these sort of eligible activities provide. We're really talking about planning activities, getting back to how can we match reuse with community needs. So when we're talking about equitable development, we're really talking about how does the reuse strategy meet or benefit the existing residents or neighboring communities. Area-wide planning really helps you think about identifying, those opportunities for all of those brownfield sites, in particular, what could be a catalyst site. And we'll circle back to that in just a moment as well. But really thinking about, how do we evaluate these opportunities? What constraints may exist for the entire range of redevelopment possibilities? Again, this is an iterative process, and your reuse strategy may very well change as you learn more through assessments or other planning activities. In particular, as you think about, what kind of land use opportunities are they? What sort of redevelopment opportunities may drive or sort of provide additional opportunities? What kinds of other investment, whether it be public or private investment, exists? What's economically feasible? What does the market demands or sort of economic trends tell us about what could be self-sustaining? Because we know in underserved communities and under-resourced communities that municipal investments are often the first investments made. But municipal investments may not be able to carry that redevelopment through to completion, and that in many cases, private investment will have to be sort of infused, and oftentimes those private investors really do they are limited by market trends or market demands. They want to make sure that whatever they're investing in is sort of self-sufficient or can pay for itself in the long term. And again, these reuse scenarios are going to change as you learn and do additional planning. But there are other sorts of planning activities. We're talking about brownfields, which, inherent in that conversation are contaminated or potentially contaminated sites. So community health is important as we think about, what is the community health impacts of these projects? How are we going to sort of transition, sell, transfer, deal with liability and other obligations, long-term obligations to protect human health as we transfer this site ownership? What are those visions? How do those community visions sort of change as we learn more about the site conditions and how that may match up with community vision? And again, we can't say resource road mapping enough, frankly, because we know that these are very expensive projects. That most of the grants, in particular cleanups, will not cover that full cost, and that other redevelopment monies are needed to sort of reach that vision. But
Be careful, butt in.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say the resource road mapping, in terms of like, if you didn't include this in your assessment grant as like one of the activities that you planned to do with that money, this is something that you could be doing right now in the meantime, gearing up for potentially being awarded or not. If you have a couple of priority sites that you really, really want to see some movement on, you can go ahead and start diving into that and figuring out, depending on what the end use of that property is going to be, kind of what are some funding options, and, just kind of building that story and that plan. And, you can be doing that right now.
Yeah, and the EPA has a plethora of great resources. And if this is something that you're interested in moving forward with, please reach out to us. We can either direct you to those resources or do a little hand holding ourselves and sort of guide you through and provide some wonderful places to look and to explore. We'll sort of touch on this in a little bit, but the federal programs guide is a wonderful place to start for brownfield projects.
Yeah. Okay.
So
here we go.
Here we go. Cue it up, right? The resource road mapping. This is the example of the EPA resource, one of the resources. They have a beautiful guide. This is their little 2-pager. But really what we're talking about are what are all of those distinct features of your full redevelopment plan outside of sort of cleanup or other potentially contaminated remediation. What are all of the components? Are there direct infrastructure needs? Are there public realm needs to make it a place for people? Are there housing infrastructure needs? Are there landscaping or solid waste infrastructure needs? Are there other components of your project that will need to be sort of implemented to fully realize your complete redevelopment vision? Beyond just the contamination or the site cleanup. Your vision is multi-layered. There are a number of pieces to your redevelopment project, and by starting to think about each of those little pieces individually and what potential funding sources may be out there, you can start to stack some capital or even imagine places where you will need to invest a little time to seek that funding as you move forward through your redevelopment project. This is the federal the 2023 Brownfields Federal Program Guide. It's a great place to start as you think about other sources of funding. The guide is available online. I think I may have overlooked putting the link here, but if you don't have access to this, please let us know. We'll share the link with you. We have shared it multiple times in other webinars. I often send it out as a part of our monthly newsletter that you all will each be receiving. If you're not receiving, I'll add you to the newsletter list. But it breaks down a number of federal agencies that have both financial assistance and available technical assistance that really marries well with your brownfield redevelopment project. But if you're starting to think about resource road mapping, what are a couple steps you may want to think about? Really, you've started to define your project components, perhaps as a part of your application. You've thought about maybe the different phases of how that could play out. You may have started to estimate the costs. In particular, if you're doing a cleanup, you've done a lot of cost estimation as a part of your application. This is where you start to identify the best sources of funding for each of those components or each of those phases. I would recommend creating a chart or a matrix or a timeline, whatever you feel most comfortable with, that starts to break down and organize that project by phase or specific sort of element, so that you can then begin to match different funding sources with each phase or element. But perhaps most importantly, as you begin to seek out this funding, update your community. Continue sort of letting folks know, even if you're applying, that is a success, whether or not you receive those funds or not. But even pursuing funds, whether or not you secure them or not, make sure, keep people updated. Let them know that you're moving forward. And really, when should you start to think about this? Well, really, once you've got some revitalization goals, however broad or narrow those may be, or you have started to identify a specific or individual brownfield project or even components, start to think about and break those down into potential funding opportunities that could support each of those. Now, again, you all have probably seen this image shared before. It really is sort of a distillation of the brownfield redevelopment process. It all starts with involving and engaging your community. And while we go over the next quarter, that still remains the same. Continue to involve and engage, update those stakeholders, keep people informed about where we're going, what the timeline is, what we're waiting for, what other sources of funding we may have found, how people could support it, or how other stakeholders could get involved. Continue to affirm that community and community vision and communicate what the ultimate reuse is. And as a reminder, this is an iterative process, right? Like, as you learn more and as you hear more and as you seek or find additional funding, that reuse strategy may grow or constrain depending on sort of what you learn or where you find yourself in the overall project. In terms of internal sort of market viability, you may start to do some feasibility or think about sort of the market studies or pro formas, the specific cost of buildings, in particular if private investors are at the table. But one caveat here with assessment, as you completed your assessment application, you certainly included some sites that you are targeting as a part of that assessment. But we know that those locations can change for a variety of reasons, whether the property owner isn't interested or willing to get engaged in a brownfield redevelopment, or there may be other properties that emerge as community priorities. So that is okay. But one strategy that you can start to deploy is continue building that inventory of target sites for redevelopment, both brownfields and potential brownfields, because that site inventory you can begin to leverage for future redevelopment opportunities or community planning strategies. It really can become sort of that database that you can go back to and think about, all right, we've sort of started to approach our priority sites. What other sites do we know or have we acknowledged or documented that our community really wants to focus some redevelopment attention? So that inventorying is really kind of a long process that you can continue to update and continue to add information to, because the more information you gather and the more data you gather, really the better decisions that you'll be able to make over the long term.
Yeah, and it doesn't end with the first grant cycle. This is again an iterative process. And once EPA kind of sees that you're successful with these grants and that things are happening, like, they're going to be more willing to hopefully put that money in your hands again to keep fighting the good fight, doing the good work. So yeah, just think about that. It's always revolving.
This is an example that we wanted to share. We really love this. This is from Paris, Kentucky. It was created by Tetra Tech. And this was the way that they are keeping their community informed about really the long view of the project. It provides some historic framing about how the project got started, sort of who's at the table, what they've done. It shows where they are and what's to come. So, like we said, these are long projects. That these sites have been eyesores potentially for a long time. The community just heard about your whopping huge grant that you've just received, and they want to see something happen. But this is really a wonderful way to be realistic, transparent, and accountable, not only to yourself but to the grant and to your community about what is the realistic roadmap that you are following as you go from idea to implementation. Now, while this is just a static image, the version that they built is very interactive, where you can click on each of these boxes and it pulls up a little window that provides a little more detail. But this is just one example that you may want to use, if you receive funding, to really keep your community informed about what has happened, where we are, and what's planning to happen, and what's on the horizon. But one thing that we will encourage you to continue thinking about are those catalyst sites, right? Like what site is what reuse site is really going to give you the biggest bang for the buck? What aligns with community need and vision? And there's a couple questions you can ask yourself or continue to ask yourself, and that is, is it within the defined area? Like, is it within our target area that we're assessing or cleaning up? Is there some plan alignment? Does it align with the vision and the needs of the community? Is it likely to spur additional development, right? So is it going to catalyze other investments or other redevelopment opportunities in adjacent or surrounding properties? Does it eliminate blight or contaminated conditions that may be creating human health or environmental issues? And then lastly, does it improve the overall quality of life of adjacent neighbors and the community at large? So, if you can start to sort of work through these questions and affirm them, more than likely you'll start to identify those catalyst sites, the ones that really can make a substantial change in your community because they meet the vision, they address need, and they spur future development. Those are really the three big things that you want to continue to think about.
So for cleanup, there's lots of cost estimates that have already been done as a part of your application process. Again, procurement is something that we're going to be thinking about at a lot of different points during this process. The success of your grant can be threatened if there are questionable or problematic audits. So you really want to make sure that your procurement practices are in line with not only your internal processes, but compliant with what EPA is asking of you. And with the extra funding, the extra bill money, there has been special attention to the way that these funds are being used. And so I would just tell you to be very careful kind of at all of those different levels. One thing I wanted to point out is that if you're considering putting in an application for fiscal year 25, it's not too early to start thinking about procurement for your project. There are a couple of different options in terms of being able to solicit somebody to help you with your grant application for fiscal year 25, and really making sure that you do that in a way that's compliant. But there are options for putting out a bid in the spring for somebody to write your application and then to go on to do the work if that is awarded. So if that's something that you're thinking about, make sure to reach out to us. We can get you in contact with the right people at EPA that make sure that that's being taken care of the way that it needs to be. But if you're not going that route, you'll likely start thinking about procurement when you get the notice of the funding award and get connected with your project officer. And I do want to point out that EPA Region 4 will review draft RFPs that you put together before you, solicit those bids. And that is going to be especially helpful to you, because if you put out an RFP and it's not compliant, they will make you take it down and repost it. And that just gives you, a late start to what has already been kind of a long process. So just making sure that everything is kind of wrapped up with a nice, pretty bow, before that even starts, and before any questions are had about it is going to be the way to go.
Yeah, it can sound intimidating, because we're getting in regulations and policies and federal oversight, but know that there's a number of resources, there's a number of people willing to support you along the way, and if this is a concern that you have, please reach out and let us know, and we'll certainly help you sort of navigate that as best as possible. Okay. So a couple things here, just thinking about moving forward. Applications were submitted November 13th. If you submitted, we've got a little wait time here, right? We'll hear back in the spring, but we also know that there's going to be an open solicitation next fall for fiscal year 25. So, as we're thinking about that, we've already kind of started to touch on that subject around procurement and using outside contract to help with that process. But there are a number of things that you can begin to think about. And some of this isn't that different than what you could be thinking about if you applied this year and are preparing for that spring announcement, right? So, as we move forward, these are the few things that are just really important no matter what time we find ourselves in. And that is affirming the vision, continue to engage the community around creating that vision or documenting needs, thinking about those inventories or expanding the inventories or adding more depth to the data that you're collecting around those sites so that you can make well-informed decisions. There's a number of other planning opportunities and community assessments that can be done that we'll touch on a little bit here. You can begin thinking and continue thinking about those catalyst sites, right? Which ones are going to give you the biggest bang for the buck? Which ones are sort of the most important for your community to revitalize or to develop reuse strategies? Obviously, looking at other grant opportunities or other resources are incredibly important. As you think about what could, how you could really leverage the value of the ideas you may have for a future application. But the last sort of bullet point here is a new program that we are going to be launching in the new year that any of you are eligible to participate in. But we're going to be launching at CEDIK, the Community Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky. We're going to be launching a new Brownfield Community Assistance Program, really to provide direct technical assistance to communities as they navigate this fiscal year 2025 solicitation process. But we'll share a little bit more about that, and we'll certainly be sharing more about that at the sort of throughout the as we get into the new year in January. But if you are thinking about applying and you currently have a grant, you may be wondering, am I eligible to apply for something else? And Kiersten, I'm going to turn it over to you because I know you have explained and shared this chart a number of times over the last 2 months.
Yeah, and this chart changes a little bit from year to year. So they'll come out with a new version of this for fiscal year 25 as you're preparing for that. I'm not going to go into every little thing, but for a community-wide, like most people on the call, I think probably have a community-wide assessment or a cleanup grant. But for a community-wide assessment, let's see, you can go on, like if you just got awarded a community-wide assessment in fiscal year 23, or you're about to get awarded one in fiscal year 24, it is possible for you to go ahead and be the applicant on a cleanup grant for fiscal year 25. So that is really the goal of getting all of these assessments completed on these brownfield properties, is ultimately getting them back into a productive reuse in your community. And a lot of that is not possible without cleanup funding for that environmental contamination. So we want to see as many of these assessment grants move on to that cleanup level. I will say you cannot do cleanup funding twice on the same property. You can take advantage of a multi-purpose application and then go on to receive cleanup funding, additional cleanup funding through EPA from that, or you can get cleanup funding through our revolving loan fund, the Cleaner Commonwealth Fund, and then go on to receive EPA cleanup funding. So there's a couple different like cleanup pots that some people aren't always like readily aware of. But yeah, if you have any questions about this, or just kind of what this looks like for you, you know, I know there are a couple organizations that are raring to go and like want to get started on multiple projects going into the next year. And I think we're going to see a lot more cleanup applications next year, as opposed to the last couple of years where everybody's just been gearing up for cleanup funding.
And one thing to note there is you know, whether or not you're eligible or not, you know, there's a number that seems significant, right? And if you notice, a lot of those do offer or require a 70% spend down of the existing grant. So that there's kind of this established threshold to keep in mind. But please do refer back to this chart or next year's updated chart for any changes. But it may be a good idea to kind of have that 70% spend down in your mind as kind of an initial threshold, whether or not you can move forward or not. Not to say that that is a requirement, but for those special circumstances, that tends to be the threshold.
Right. Yeah. Especially if you're going from like assessment grant to like going into the next assessment grant, they do want you to have those funds expended. So a lot of that too is making sure that you're being diligent about the way that you're spending your funds on the front end. You know, if you were just awarded in fiscal year 23 or going to be awarded in fiscal year 24, just keep in mind that, you know, you're not necessarily rushing to get this money out the door, but at the same time, it's important that you think about that and just think about, you know, if you're not spending that money on the front end, then you are gonna, you know, pay for that a little bit in terms of when you're going to be able to apply for the next round. Oh, you're still muted. Sorry.
I muted myself. Sorry about that. So one thing we are really excited to announce and share with you all as a part of this partnership is really a community cohort model that we're going to be launching in January. We're doing some refinement and planning next month. It's one of the reasons we'll not be hosting a webinar next month. We really want to put some time and energy into this. We'll be launching it in January, and it'll be running really throughout the entire year, wrapping up with that grant cycle. So we anticipate sort of November, December, depending on how that plays out. But really, the goal of this emerging program is to connect under-resourced and underserved communities with additional resources. We want to sort of help with redevelopment community planning processes. So we're going to be doing some workshops focused on, you know, how do you build your team? How do we define that project area? What sorts of information should we be collecting or could we be collecting with our community? We're going to be providing some direct technical assistance, doing some hand-holding that we haven't been able to really offer in the past with funding limitations. So we're going to be supporting some really cool and innovative community engagement opportunities and engaged assessments, helping communities think about how do we prioritize our projects with all of these ideas that our community has. Because if you've been engaged in any kind of community planning process, you know that there are an infinite amount of ideas that your community can have but you often can't do them all at the same time. And there has to be a sense of prioritization. But we're also going to be supporting communities thinking about grant writing and preparing for that fiscal year 2025 grant opportunity, and thinking about what other grant opportunities or resources may be out there. So doing some of that resource road mapping. This really is going to be a new pilot project. I say that to suggest that, if you're struggling to address existing vacant, abandoned, dilapidated, or potentially contaminated buildings, this program may be for you. If you know that you have opportunities in your downtown, but you just can't seem to make things happen, this new program may be for you and your community. If you've applied for Brownfield funding in the past, but have never received it, this program is for you, because we want to leverage the work that you've done and really help you and support you to create and submit that highly competitive application. We know these funds, while we are seeing more grant funding and more grant funds in terms of frequency, we know they are also just as competitive. So we want you to be as competitive as possible. And if you've submitted an application or completed an assessment, but you never followed up with that cleanup of any of the properties that you assessed, this project or this program may be for you. It will be a cohort model. So we're going to be working with probably a half a dozen communities or community coalitions throughout the state that sort of check all of these or a number of these boxes. So if you think you may be, or if you're looking at these questions and saying, we do have vacant or abandoned buildings, or we do have a beautiful downtown that has some vacant or abandoned buildings that we know we could make things happen, or we've thought about funding in the past or have received it and never really followed up with that next step, I'm here to suggest that this program may be for you. And we're going to be sort of outlining and sharing some more information over the coming month and into the new year, and inviting communities to participate. But if this is something that you are interested in, please don't hesitate to reach out. You see on the slide there our contact information, our emails. Please reach out. Let us know that you're interested in learning more, and we'll follow up and have a conversation, sort of share some of the details that we'll be releasing over the coming weeks. And we would love to have you be a part of it. But that concludes our final webinar of the year. I want to thank each of you for participating and joining us. We are and have been recording this webinar. So as this gets uploaded onto our YouTube page, where we are hosting all of the other Brownfield webinar series, I will be sharing that with you probably within the week. I'll also share some additional resources that we've touched on within this webinar. So I'll send out the links to some of those Brownfield resources or EPA resources, the planning activities, the program guide. I'll make sure you have access to all of that. And I'll also be sending out our newsletter that we put together monthly. So you'll be receiving sort of updated information in particular as we launch this new technical assistance program. But I want to give folks just a minute or two if you have any questions. We don't have any right now. So I want to give folks just another minute or two. If you do have a question or comment that you'd like to share, please use that Q&A function. We'll stay on for just a minute. But otherwise, we wish you all well, happy holidays, and we look forward to working with you in the new year. So we'll wait just one moment here, see if there's any questions or comments, and if not, we'll go ahead and wrap up.